Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This session is part of the IWA and Canal and River Trust training and workshop programme for 2020. My name's Katie Woodruff and I'm the Restoration Coordinator for the Canal and River Trust. Now for today's webinar, we are excited that we're joined by Lewis Banks-Hughes, who is our delivery planner at the Canal and River Trust, who will be talking about planning consent and how to work with your local authorities. And on that note, I'll hand straight over to Lewis and we'll get started.
Right, thanks, Katie. So my name's Lewis Banks-Hughes and I'm a delivery planner at the Canal and River Trust. So I joined the Trust in 2019 and I'm a town planner, background in development management and planning policy. So they're the two main sides of planning, from the sort of planning application side and also the policy side that planning applications are determined against. So worked on a variety of different applications from sort of household extensions conservatories through to retail parks and sort of major residential developments, and also have an interest in historic building conservation and the adaptive reuse of old buildings, so changing old buildings into sort of modern uses. So today's workshop's on basically planning, an introduction to planning for those people who might need to be involved in the process at some point. I know some of you probably have been involved previously of sort of planning applications and sort of planning permission for things. So it's just sort of a rough overview of the process. Talks about, is planning permission required? Are other consents required? The pre-application sort of advice process, which from the outset I'd recommend everyone go through before submitting a planning application. Planning process itself, followed by a decision notice and any changes that are required. So maybe your scheme changes slightly after the consent's issued and you need to make changes to the planning permission. So just a bit about my role at the Trust. So there are two planning teams at the Trust, the National Spatial Planning Team and the Planning Delivery Team. So the Spatial Planning Team are sort of the part of the Trust that responds to planning consultations on planning applications, so policy documents and government policy. So they're a sort of outward facing arm of the Trust as far as planning is concerned. The delivery team, so my team, focuses on delivery of Trust projects, essentially. So here's a sort of list of the projects we're involved with. So it's asset improvement works, anything from bridges to reservoirs, towpath improvements, anything that sort of improves the infrastructure. Works to the Trust estate and investment projects. So that could be anything from lockkeepers' houses through to sort of commercial developments that we have as investment, part of investment portfolio. We've also got leisure and residential moorings, marketing and signage. We also resolve planning enforcement threats. So if someone's done something on our land that we need to, that we get approached by the council about and asked to resolve, so that could be an unauthorised mooring, could be fly tipping, could be some development, one of our estates that needs, estate properties that need sorting out. We're the sort of team that will handle that and try and resolve it. And also involved in some restoration projects. So I know my sort of introduction to this workshop mentioned I helped out with Schoolhouse Bridge. So that was on the Montgomery Canal, and we sort of advised on the planning side of that. Here are just some sort of examples of the projects that the National Delivery Planning Team has been involved with. They are, I would say, some of the sort of few graphics in this, so I hope you enjoy these before it gets quite text heavy. But just a couple of examples here. So sort of a bridge restoration, the River Severn Fish Passes project. My colleague Phil Smith, who's also sort of on the presentation, has been involved with. A couple of yards that we run and manage. So these sort of welfare facilities for volunteers and staff involved with the canal, and a couple of residential mooring sites. So we sort of installed the infrastructure there, facilities, parking, sort of toilet blocks, facilities for all those residential mooring customers. a couple of other projects, got the inland port project, Sturton Wharf, and also Welcome Hub in Manchester. And finally, this is our Project Compass signage project. So following the sort of switch from British Waterways to Canal and River Trust, we had to do a sort of big rebranding exercise. So that's sort of where you see all the black swan British Waterways signs changed over to the Canal and River Trust blue branding. So we're sort of rolling this out still across the country. So is planning permission required? That's the sort of starting point for this this talk. Generally, yes, is the sort of straightforward answer. So it's needed if development or the work's been carried out meet the statutory definition of development. So that's set out in section 55 of the Town and Country Planning Act. But sort of breaking that down, so that's building operations, so anything to do with structural alterations, construction, rebuilding, and most demolition, and engineering operations such as groundwork. So I've highlighted those. I think they're the most important ones as far as restoration goes to be aware of. So essentially most, and I will caveat that later, but most projects undertaken in relation to restoration will require planning permission. There are some sort of works that don't require it. So the any internal operations, so if you potentially got a building that you're part of your restoration you're looking to restore, interior alterations don't require consent, and any operations that don't affect the external appearance, and the same with changes of use, although they're probably a bit rarer on restoration projects. One point to note on demolition, so that does generally include most things. There are a couple of exceptions, and it all depends on the sort of height of what you're demolishing, the volume of it, etc. But even if planning permission is not required, sometimes prior approval is required, in which case you need to notify the council before actually proceeding with the demolition. So as I was saying, all work which falls in definition of development will require planning permission. Although whether you apply to the council for planning permission, there's various options. So some types of work are covered by the General Permitted Development Order, and that's essentially national planning permission. So that will allow certain works to be undertaken without needing to make a planning application. So some of the sort of more common ones, so if you've ever done a sort of house extension or any sort of thing to do with residential property, you'll be aware that there's various things you could do. So you can put an extension up, for example, up to a certain size. You can fit windows without planning permission. There's various sorts of things covered by General Permitted Development Order that you can do on that. In terms of restoration projects, I've put a couple of examples here. So Part 2 Class A and Part 2 Class C. So that's the construction of gates, fences and walls and enclosures. So you might come across those. And also painting of any buildings or work undertaken. So that covers sort of essentially repair and maintenance type activities on there. So there's also some broader permitted development rights. So as I was saying earlier, most things need planning consent. A lot of restoration projects would be covered by these two classes. So we've got Part 8 Class B and Part 8 Class C. So the trust and sort of delivery team rely on Part 8 Class B quite a lot, and that relates to any works essentially on the canal, inland waterway navigations to do with the movement of traffic. So that could be anything from bridges to leisure moorings and sort of everything in between. Importantly, where we own the land and where we're where it's operational land and we're the statutory undertaker. Those rights can be used by restoration groups where the trust is the landowner and the statutory undertaker. More likely though, your works will fall into Part 8 Class C, and that's works to inland waterways. I'll go into each of these in a bit more depth in a second, but I've just noted here that if there's any doubt as to whether a particular project benefits from permitted development rights, certificate of lawful development should be obtained from the LPA. So that's the local planning authority, or the arm of the council that essentially deals with planning permission. Also worth noting, there are a few exemptions, restrictions, limitations of these. I haven't included those, but you need to be aware of them before sort of proceeding with projects under either of these classes. So this is Class B, so Part 8 Class B, as I said, the one that the Trust relies on mostly. So it's development and operational land by statutory undertakers or their lessees in respect of dock, pier, harbour, water transport, or canal, inland navigation undertakings. So that's required for the purposes of shipping, or in connection with all those things there, and I said the movement of traffic, etc. And just an example here of the restrictions. So it's a hotel or bridge that's not connected, or educational building, car park, etc. So it sort of does need to relate to the canal in order to be relevant. Class C, so this is one that's more relevant. So that's the improvement, maintenance, or repair of an inland waterway, and that's other than a commercial waterway or cruising waterway, to which Section 104 of the Transport Act applies. Which I'll go into in a second, but it's also the repair and maintenance of various different bits of canal infrastructure. So that will cover the majority of sort of small to medium scale restoration projects in order to improve inland waterways. As I said, so 104, so that applies to the commercial waterways. And just going into that, there are two parts of that. So part one's commercial waterways, part two's cruising waterways. So it's worth saying on this point that if the waterway that you're working on falls within either of these two lists, then it would need planning permission, because this particular class, so Part 8 Class C, wouldn't apply. So you would need to just make sure it's not in either of these two lists before relying on that permitted development right. And it's also worth noting that each council will interpret Part 8 Class C differently. So it's always worth engaging with them from the start to check whether they agree that the works that you're proposing fall under this class. If they don't, there's obviously a risk to your projects, and they could require you to basically revert any changes that you've done. So even if planning permission or planning application isn't required, you may require other consents under other regimes. So that could include works to trees, so TPO's tree protection order, or tree preservation order, and works in conservation areas. So if you're chopping down a tree over a certain diameter, even though it might not need planning permission and it's in a conservation area, it might need you to make an application to the council for them to assess whether or not that can be chopped down. Advertisement consent, if you're putting up any signage, certain types of advert or signage can be put up without consent, in which case it's deemed consent. If it's over a certain size, you will require advertisement consent, separate sort of planning permission relating specifically to signs. List of building consent, if you're working with any buildings or structures, so a lot of locks are listed, a lot of canal structures listed, a lot of buildings are listed. It's worth checking that, making sure that if your project does include them and you're making alterations to them, that's internally or externally or within the curtilage of the building, it's always worth just confirming the list of building consent is not required. And if it is required, I'm not going to cover that here, but you will need to make an application for list of building consent. A few other things there, well, hazardous substances, environmental permits, building regs, just all covered. Obviously depends on what sorts of projects you're going to be involved with. I've added at the end that an environmental impact assessment may be required. So certain types of development, it depends on the scale of development, will meet the threshold for requiring an environmental impact assessment. And that's essentially a an explanation of the impacts of the development on the environment. And I'd suggest that if you've reached that sort of level, I'd probably get specialist advice, so planning consultant, etc., involved in your project. And the idea of that is to essentially make sure that you're not sort of causing harm to the environment by the sort of scale and nature of the project. So I've just got a brief break here on questions relating to the first half of the presentation. And then we'll cover the sort of planning application side. So if you decided that you need to go down that route, so I think Katie's going to suggest some questions.
Excellent, thank you, Lewis. We've had a couple of questions come into the Q&A box. Can you explain and differentiate between the planning application and the building warrant?
Okay. So there's two sort of, I assume you mean well, sort of building regulations or sort of building control side of stuff there. So there's two sort of parts of, I guess, the construction process. One is the planning side of it. So that's everything to do with planning permission, the look and feel of the building, external appearance, what it's going to be used for, land use, essentially. And the building regulation side of stuff is all to do with the sort of construction of it, the building integrity, whether or not it meets requirements. I mean, if you were looking at a house, for example, that would be, are you using the right sort of beams to construct it, right foundations, right sort of electrics and things. Majority of restoration projects not involving buildings will not be covered by that, so there's no need to sort of consider that for these types of projects.
Okay, cool, thank you. Does an interpretation sign or board with no advertising that is fixed in the ground adjacent to a public footpath need any permissions or consent?
The answer is potentially. For planning purposes, an advertisement is any sign. It doesn't matter if it's advertising Coca-Cola or it's just a map of the a map of the canal. Any signage needs may need advertisement consent. There's certain classes in advertisement consent under deemed consent which allow certain signs of certain sizes to be put up for certain reasons. I can't cover all of those here, but if you search on the gov.uk website for advertisement consent, it will explain what those are, and there's a sort of guide that explains different sizes. In terms of interpretation signage, we have been successful in putting that up without advertisement consent, but we have checked with the council beforehand. So it depends who's putting it up and what it's going to show, but some councils will agree to that under deemed consent.
Okay, excellent. What was the document there that you said to refer to on the government website?
So there's a gov.uk website, search for advertisement consent,
okay.
And it will explain everything in there. And there's a document on there, which I think it's called a visual guide or advertiser's guide to advertisement consent. And there's lots of sort of pictures of all the different types of advert that you can install without advertisement consent.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. Have we got time for one more here?
Yeah.
Does the improvement, maintenance or repair PDR exemption class C extend to replacement works such as relocated lock or channel? Sorry, I've just lost that. Relocated lock or channel diversion?
It would probably depend if they're temporary. I'd suggest on the face of it that would need planning permission, so it wouldn't apply. But again, it's a case of making that case to the council. It is a very broad class, is Part C. So one council may agree, another council may not. But the idea is improvement rather than wholesale sort of replacement or brand new development. So I'd err towards planning permission for that.
Okay, thank you. One more. Back to the permitted development and when this applies for repair of inland waterways, etc. What is the definition of an inland waterway here? How far can it be if a remainder waterway has been sold off, disappeared, etc.? I understand the PD rights for repair don't apply.
Again, I'd refer to the council on that. It's up to them to make the interpretation as to whether it would apply or not. I'd suggest at least some infrastructure would need to be there. We have worked on the Montgomery Canal, as I said, and I'd say probably about half of that was under not underground. It wasn't in water, so the root of it was still there, but it wasn't a canal in the conventional sense. It would need extensive restoration to become a canal, and that we were looking to do that under Part C. So it depends on the council, depends on the nature of the waterway, but the key thing there is it needs to be a remainder waterway, so not listed in cruising or commercial waterways, for that to be relevant. What you can't do is just go and dig a hole and claim that you've got a canal and then and then try and use that class under it. So it does need to be an existing canal. But as far as I know, there's no set time limit. It's just what the council will agree with you on.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. One more here. Where a disused canal is dry but has not been filled in, I understand that planning permission is not needed for restoration, as it is effectively heavy-duty maintenance. Is that correct?
So, subject to what I've said before about cruising commercial waterways, if it's remainder waterway, that's the sort of project that would fall under Class C. So, as in it would benefit from permitted development, and you wouldn't need to apply for planning permission. Although bear in mind what I've said about the A, checking with the council, and B, if there's any doubt, obtain a certificate of lawful development. And that, I didn't explain that in great deal detail earlier. That's essentially a certificate granted by the council, which says that your development's lawful. So you sort of need to make a planning application to the council about that, but it's not quite in the same. It's not quite the same scope as a planning application, but essentially protects you if they come after you at a later date for digging a hole without consent. So it's a sort of way of protecting the project.
Excellent, thank you, Lewis. That's all the questions that we've got in there for now. If anyone has any more throughout the presentation, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll come back to these at the end. For now, pass back to Lewis.
Okay, thank you. So pre-application advice. So at this stage, you've established that planning permission is required, or in certain circumstances, if you don't know if it is required, say we were saying earlier about whether or not it benefited from permitted development rights, this is a process that can be used to establish the council's thoughts on the project that you're doing. So it's not compulsory, but it's advisable and can result in the resolution of difficult issues prior to submission of planning application. It doesn't include neighbour consultation, so it's purely a council-run process focused on sort of the council's internal consultees and a few other things that I'll cover in a second. I've noted here that applicants should discuss the proposal with neighbours and landowners and other parties before submitting a formal application. It's also worth doing that as part of sort of pre-application advice. So the important thing is to get everybody on board with the application before submitting it for planning. So the fees for pre-application advice can vary. It can be £0, it can be thousands of pounds, depends on the size of the project, who the council is, and where it is. London councils, for example, cost an absolute fortune, and other councils, for example Birmingham, don't charge for initial pre-application advice. So it very much depends on the council. And then there are some other councils that do apply fee reductions for charities and community organisations, which the restoration groups would fall under. So as I said here, service provided by each local planning authority will vary. And this is a sort of additional service that they offer. They're not required to offer this, but those that do tend to charge for it, but also use it as part of the planning process. So if you've gone through the pre-application process, that will help act as sort of material consideration or part of their considerations when they subsequently when you subsequently submit a planning application. They'll refer back to it and make sure that you've sort of addressed everything that they've picked up in the pre-application. So I've borrowed this from Coventry City Council's website, but this sort of explains what they would do as part of the pre-application. So they provide an early indication as to the acceptability or unacceptability of a proposal, early identification of the issues that need to be addressed prior to submission of a formal application, and knowledge on how national, regional, local guidance will be applied to your development. So I'm not going to cover that in great detail here, but every council has a local plan, or multiple parts of a local plan, and there's also national planning policy framework and national planning policy guidance that all affect how development is undertaken. So your development should essentially comply with those policies in order to be considered acceptable. So by going through the pre-application process, they'll assess, the council will assess how each of those policies apply to your development and which ones you would need to take account of, which ones you meet the criteria of, which ones you don't. And then it's up to you as in the subsequent planning application, whether you're able to justify compliance with those planning policies. Just a sort of indication of the types of policies, it could be anything from flood risk to design and appearance, location. With canal restorations specifically, there will not be a policy on canal restorations in general. There'll be ones relating to, as I said, design and flood risk, and you'll mostly be coming at ones to do with the environment, trees, sort of the things that underpin your restoration project, as opposed to say a residential development, for example, that's got specific policies regarding that. So as part of the pre-application advice, they'll also provide an early indication of when you'll need to appoint specialists. They might not specifically list all of these, but they will give you a general idea as to the types of application required. So some of the issues there: highways, drainage, arboricultural, so that's trees, environmental protections, that's everything from noise, contamination, pollution, design, ecology, biodiversity. So that's, for example, bats, otters, mammals, great crested newts, everything that's potentially a sort of a limitation or constraint or something which needs to be mitigated as a result of your development would be covered under that advice. And then lastly, there is heritage and conservation. So that could relate to maybe a listed building, listed lock, listed structure, bridge, for example, or if your canal runs through a conservation area, then you'll need to sort of seek advice on that and then make a case that the development doesn't cause harm to the character and appearance of the conservation area. And some policies have, some councils rather, have policies relating to, say, the preservation of the canal itself. So there's some more guidance provided there. And lastly on this, they'll provide sort of advice on the plans and supporting documents you'll need to submit with your application to ensure it's valid on receipt. So as part of the pre-application advice, there's just a sort of list here of the things that you would need to submit. So you can apply at any point for this. It's a good way of determining from the outset whether or not it's likely to be acceptable to the council. I would say though that you would need to ensure that you have enough information to ask the council in order to get a sort of reasonable response from them. So you need to have worked out your route, for example, the scope of the works that you're planning to do, how are you going to do them, any sketches of any, say you want to reconstruct a bridge or part of a lock or something, including as much detail as possible will only help you at pre-application stage. So I wouldn't do it too early, but you can never be too early, especially in where there's potential for sort of public opposition, or there's any sort of significant constraints. It's always worth being aware of those up front. So some of the documents here: site location plan, sketches or illustrations, photographs. It's more important during sort of COVID, because everybody's avoiding site visits where possible, and also planning or design statement. But as I said, that can be as short or as long as you need it, as long as it includes details about the scopes of the works, etc. So you should receive a response within 10 to 30 days, but there's no set time scale. As I said before, this isn't a service councils have to provide. Most of them do, but there's no time limits such as there are with plan applications. And I've also said here, the more information you submit, the more detailed the response will be, but avoid overloading the council with too much information. So make sure it's quite concise, and you ask a list of questions which you'd like to be answered. If there's any specific issues, so say there's a particular tree, for example, that needs to be removed, it's worth asking that specific question to make sure this is addressed as part of the pre-app. So it's not just the council that offers pre-application advice. List of other organisations here, so Canal and River Trust via the National Spatial Planning Team, Environment Agency, Historic England, Natural England. Most restoration projects, especially small scale ones, aside from Canal and River Trust, would probably not need to specifically consult these organisations. Larger ones, where maybe flood risk becomes an issue, you're going through particularly sensitive landscape, there's particular issues with ecology, may wish to seek pre-application advice with those organisations as well. Although the council sometimes does approach them on your behalf as part of the pre-app, and they definitely will as part of the planning application. But it's worth making sure that if there are significant issues, you approach them beforehand. The Canal and River Trust does offer a free pre-application advice service, so that is particularly relevant to canals belonging to the trust or which will connect to the trust network. So it's always worth seeking advice on that from our spatial planning team, and they'll consult various people within the trust to make sure that everybody's content with what you're proposing and that it meets our various standards for, say, towpaths, structures, etc. Last point on here, that not all planning authorities consult elected members or say councillors as part of the pre-application process, but you may wish to engage with local members early as part of this, and they will only help if you can get them on your side from the start. If it does sort of proceed further, if there's opposition, concern with the council, having a good relationship with them will help your project, not least because it would explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and that can sort of help them explain that to others within the council. So preparing your planning applications, this is sort of the next stage after pre-app. So you've received your response from the council. They presumably said they're happy for you to proceed. They've given you a list of bits that you need to have a look at. Now is just sort of time to start preparing the actual application itself. I've said here, if your scheme changes substantially, so that's by design or circumstances. So schemes do change. You could discover something that you didn't know was there. I don't know, underground cables, or a bat in a tree, or other forms of wildlife. So essentially constraints which mean that design needs to change. It's worth, or you change the design of the project itself. So you want a different not colour necessarily, but a different form of development. It's definitely worth applying for for further advice, just to clarify that the council's happy with that approach that you're taking. So the pre-application advice should include details of the plans and documents you'll need to submit. But there's also a local validation checklist. So this is a sort of list of documents provided by the council that explains what you need to submit as part of a planning application. So again, donated by Coventry, but we've got some examples here of national validation requirements. So these would apply for any type of application. So you've got your application form, you've got your ownership certificate and agricultural land declaration. That point is particularly worth noting. It's a good idea to understand who owns the land that you're working on, and that the canals on, the towpaths on, the land that you need to use to be able to do the works is on, and seek agreement from those people before undertaking the work. You can get details of who owns what from the land registry website. I don't know, so you have to search the land, pay a fee. They'll provide you with title register and title plan, and that will help you establish who owns what. And within that, there's different types of ownership. So if you know who everyone is, you can list those, serve notice on them. So that's essentially a letter that you send to them to say we own the land, we're planning to do this work. And if you don't know who owns it, there's a process for that in terms of publicising it, putting a notice up, just so everybody who might need to be involved is involved. And this is the planning side of stuff. Obviously, if people own land, they'll probably want to sell it to you, or they'll need to come up to some agreement with them in order to do the work on their land. So I'm not going to cover that here, but that's obviously a separate issue which you need to take into account. Site location plan, there's set scales for those. So that's the area of your site needs to be outlined in red, and any other land needs to be outlined in blue. Plans and drawings. I mean, this can be there's infinite number of plans and drawings which you can produce, and it depends on the nature of the scheme. And there's a few examples later on which will explain what's required. Design and access statement. It's not always required. It depends on the size of the project, but it's a good idea to explain sort of everything from materials, how you're going to access the site, why you're doing it, a bit of a justification for it. Any issues with accessibility, for example, are worth covering under that statement. And just at the top there, you can sort of see that some councils require it if it's in a conservation area or involves listed building, for example. So it's just worth checking that list, and also the correct fee which needs to be paid. So local requirements. These are sort of the next stage of plans, and they explain a bit more about the types of drawings that you might require. So you've got block plan, site plan, existing proposed floor plans. Clearly that's only relevant if you have got a building that you're doing. If not, you're probably more likely to submit a site plan, so before and after sort of aerial view of the site and how that's going to look. And also existing proposed elevations. Again, roof plans, depends on the type of development. Sections, so they're cross sections, particularly useful for canal restorations, bridges, anything that you sort of need to see how it will fit in. They're useful for explaining those, and also levels. So if you're changing the level, so for example, wedging, for example, or removing earth, creating new features from it, that will help to explain those works to the council. Just briefly mentioning heritage applications here. So these are potentially things that involve listed buildings. Starting to get a bit more involved, but you need things like photographic record, so what's there before you make any changes. Heritage statements, that explains what you're doing, how it will affect the significance of the building. Schedule of work, so exactly what you're doing. That's quite detailed, and it's sort of a mythology, I guess, for how you do those works. archaeological assessment, I'd say that may be potentially required for restoration projects. It depends where they're going through and how sensitive the area is. The council will be able to advise you on that as part of the pre-application advice. Most councils have a historic records team, and they'll be able to sort of look at that and say, oh, it's particularly sensitive, or no, it's not, and they'll advise you on that basis. And lastly, they've got a structural survey. May also be applicable to other applications. It just depends what sort of works you're doing, structures are involved with. So other documents, they can be, they can include these. So you've got flood risk assessment. So that depends on the flood zone that your development's in. If you're doing a building and it's in a particularly risky flood zone, then you'll need to undertake a flood risk assessment. Likewise, if you're planning moorings, for example, they will also potentially need a flood risk assessment. Tree survey, bat survey, biodiversity and ecological survey and report, contaminated land assessment and construction environmental management plan. All of those are fairly typical documents that you need to submit. Again, it does depend on the nature of the proposal. Clearly, if you don't have a tree, you don't need a tree survey. But if you do have a tree, you may need a bat survey. So there's various things that you need to consider there. Just some tips on preparing a planning application. I would highly recommend appointing a planning consultant. Make sure they have appropriate experience in what you're doing. RTPI websites, the Royal Town Planning Institute, has a directory of people who can help with applications. Having said that, if it is a small scale project, there's nothing stopping you preparing an application yourself. But just make sure that you cover all the bases, rely on the pre-application advice you receive, and sort of try and prepare a concise submission to the council. Use specialist consultants for reports. Some of those reports can't be done yourself. They need specialist input. Make sure that you seek advice where needed, but do compare fee proposals. Different people charge different amounts of money, and it's always worth comparing. Likewise, if there are linked issues, for example, a tree survey and a ecological plan, for example, it's probably best going to the same people who can prepare both of those, because they're quite interlinked documents. Last point here is use CAD for planning drawings. So they are computer generated drawings rather than hand drawn drawings. For the pre-app stage, hand drawn things are absolutely fine. For planning application stage, because they need to be at a set scale, it's always worth doing the sort of electronic plans, and that will help council measure them. They look a bit neater, and they can be changed very easily, which is quite important if the council seek changes on the scheme. And I've added here that context is important. By that, what I mean that if you're restoring a lock, for example, it is not just the lock that the council are interested in, they're interested in the wider context. So your drawings will need to reflect that. They want to see how the development affects the immediate context. And I've also said there that it isn't always the immediate context. If the canal has a particular policy or requirement, say a conservation requirement, which affects the whole canal, they will want to see that considered in the whole, not just the specific part that you're working on. So yeah, the context is different depending on what you're proposing. This is just an example of a plan that was done for the for Schoolhouse Bridge. So it's on the Montgomery Canal. So our team worked with the Montgomery Restoration Trust to do these plans, and they sort of just, that's an example of what that plan would look like. Showing the bridge, shows materials, it's got heights on, and it sort of just it gives the council everything they need to be able to determine that application. And at the end, I'll show some further examples, just explaining the sort of process we went through for the Montgomery Canal. So once you've submitted your application, or whilst you're preparing it rather, good idea to undertake consultation before submitting it. It's essentially public consultation. So explain your proposal to local residents, local members, so councillors, parish councils, interest groups. And the idea of this is to avoid or be aware of issues that might come up once your application has been submitted. It's a good idea to be able to respond to issues. It's very tempting to just say, this is what we're doing, we're just telling you about it. But in practice, if people have concerns about it, it's always worth trying to address those up front before submitting the application. What the last thing you want is for people to start objecting whilst the application is with the council. That will complicate matters, and it's harder to make changes at that stage. The last point here is during COVID-19, there's been a significant move towards online consultation, so use of social media to explain proposals, things like video calls, Zoom calls, with parish councillors to explain how to what the project's about, and it's a good way of speaking to them when you can't meet on site, for example. And videos are also good if you show sort of a video walkthrough, just shot on a phone, for example, what you plan to do, a bit of explanation, voiceover. That will help explain it. It's definitely a good idea. So planning applications need to be submitted online via the planning portal. So that's a sort of government/commercial website for the submission of planning applications. The fee for the application will depend on the nature of the proposed and site area. They range in scale, of course. Most restoration schemes will fall under the other operations fee category. So that's £234 per 0.1 of hectare up to £2,028. That will cover the vast majority of restoration schemes, again, if planning permission is required. And you will also need to pay a separate fee at the same time to the planning portal, and that's didn't used to cost anything, but it's now £25 per application. So once the application's been submitted, it'll be validated by the planning authority, and this is when they check that you've submitted all of the information required. Importantly, they won't process the application until that information is received. So the clock, as it were, wouldn't start until they've confirmed it's valid and it's been registered. Once it has been registered, it will be assigned to a case officer, so a planning officer in the council, and they then have between 8 and 13 weeks to determine the application. 8 weeks for minor applications, 13 weeks for major applications, and that's dependent on the size of the site area. So larger scale schemes, entire canal restorations are likely to be major schemes, and the main difference here is whether or not they are considered at officer level or by the planning committee, and also the timeframes and how they're perceived and treated by the council. So in a similar way to the pre-application advice stage, the case officer will consult relevant internal and external consultees. So it could include highways officer, tree officer, conservation officer, etc. And they'll also undertake neighbour consultation. So they'll write to neighbours around the sort of immediate boundary of the site and just notify them that an application has been submitted. Again, depending on the nature of the works, but most of the time they'll display a site notice, and advertise the application in the local newspaper. Again, depends on whether it's minor or major, or affecting listed buildings, conservation area, etc. Consultation process lasts 3 to 4 weeks usually, but comments can be accepted right up until the application is determined. So if someone writes in on the last day, it does tend to need to be considered, but it's case by case depending on the council. During this time, the case officer will visit the site and undertake a site visit. May involve other consultees as well, It's a good idea to meet them on site if that's possible, if you're allowed to do that in the current climate, and sort of explain the proposal in more detail. It gives a bit of a I guess a human touch. It helps explain what you're proposing, why you're doing it, and you can build up a bit of a relationship with the council, which will come in handy later down the line or for subsequent applications. So if any comments are raised during the consultation process, the case officer will contact you to discuss any concerns raised, and they may also request additional information or minor changes in order to make the proposal acceptable. So they might like the materials, for example. It might need to be a particular type of stone, for example, a particular type of brick, especially with heritage type projects. Bricks, use of correct mortar and things will be considered in detail by the council and their sort of heritage advisors. And clearly, we've also the trust has also got heritage advisors who you may be able to ask for advice on those before submitting the application. So they'll review that. They'll review any comments received from members of the public, and they may discuss those with you. There may be issues that you wish to address as part of that. Some tips here is be ready to provide the information requested. So if you don't, and they require that to determine the application will be refused. So it's a good idea to have, I guess, a team on standby, or any of the consultants you've used. If you've got, say, an architect or engineer doing your plans for you, it's a good idea to have them ready to respond to any changes if needed. If major issues identified can't be easily resolved, you can withdraw the application and make changes and then resubmit it. It's not quite the same as a rejection, so it wouldn't count as a reason for them to not then review and consider your subsequent application. It's worth saying though, if you have gone through the pre-application advice stage, it's unlikely that major issues are going to be identified. I mean, that's the whole point of the pre-application advice, is to allow those issues to be resolved before the application is submitted. Where this becomes an issue is where the scheme's changed significantly and the advice that you've received doesn't necessarily match the scheme that you've then gone on to submit. So again, it's just worth keeping that dialogue up with the council. So once any issues have been resolved and further consultation has been undertaken, so to change the material, they might ask the heritage person to have another look at it, check they're happy with it. Case officer will prepare an examination report or a planning report, and that will assess the proposal against the national policy requirements, taking into account material considerations and any comments raised. So the policy aspects there, ones I discussed before, the local plan or national planning policy guidance or policy framework, planning policy framework, and we'll just to check that the project sort of complies with all of those policies, and if it doesn't, whether there's any sort of public benefits or anything outweighs the reasons why they don't comply. Material considerations there. There is a whole list. If you search on the RTPI website, they'll explain what the material considerations are in a planning application. They vary depending case by case, but if you've provided all documents required, all the plans required, and say for example there's a tree that you need to do some work around, and you've gone to the extent of doing a tree report, they've identified what you need to do, how you need to do it, and there's a suitable mitigation plan, so maybe you need to plant some additional trees, that will help address that sort of particular point if that's raised. So when you submit an application, and so the case officer's done their report, if it's to be determined under delegated powers, so most simple applications are, majority of applications are, the council will issue a decision notice, and if it's over a particular threshold, that's usually dependent on the size of the site, or it's a particularly controversial application, there's lots of public interest in it. then the council will be considered by planning committee. And essentially that's taken out of the case officer's hands. He makes a recommendation, he or she makes a recommendation to the planning committee. And then the planning committee have a debate on the application, weigh up pros and cons, and then make a decision. And then the decision notice is issued off the back of that. If the application goes to planning committee, you may be invited to speak. I'd highly recommend that. You don't get very long. It depends, between 2 and 5 minutes, depends on the council. But it's a good opportunity to explain the merits of the scheme to the council if it gets that far. And again, that might be done by Zoom at the moment. Before, you'd have to stand up and address everyone in a room. Now it can all be done by Zoom, Skype, etc. So the decision notice, once the application's been determined, you'll receive a decision notice. They last for usually around 3 years or 3 years. Certain circumstances, particularly large-scale restorations, you might be able to negotiate for a longer time frame, but the standard is 3 years. They will include various planning conditions, and I'll show an example of a decision notice in a second. You need to read those very carefully, as some may require you to submit additional information before you can start on site. So you may need to provide details of materials, for example, a plan showing where the people building the bridge are going to park, how you're going to minimise noise, etc. All those sort of issues need to be addressed before you can start work on site. To discharge planning conditions, you need to submit a further application to the planning authority, and the fee for that's £116, again plus the £25 planning portal fee. But that's not per condition. So say you've got 5 conditions, if you're able to submit them all at once, you just pay one fee. So it's a good way of sort of saving some money there, and it can take up to 8 weeks to discharge planning conditions. So I hope that gives an idea of the how long it takes for the planning process. You've got your pre-app, which is around a month. You've got time to actually prepare the application. Application itself between 8 and 13 weeks. Time to prepare the any information required for conditions, that will take several weeks, and then up to 8 weeks to discharge planning conditions. So it can take several months to go from start to end of the planning process. To shorten that, I mean, they're the time limits most councils work to them. If you have got a good relationship with them, things like planning conditions can usually be discharged earlier if required, or if it's seen necessary to be able to make a start on site. So I'll come back to some examples of a decision notice. I think it's just important to just show exactly what it is and the sort of conditions that would apply usually. Just before that though, changes, it's worth saying projects do change. I've said their changes are inevitable. They do need to be carefully managed though, to avoid the need for apply for planning application again. If they're minor changes, usually they can be done without the need to reapply for planning permission via non-material amendment. So that's small things. So maybe something needs to move slightly. Anything sort of larger, for example, you need to change the from brick to stone, for example, something that makes a significant change to the external appearance of something. Maybe a bridge, you need to change the shape of the bridge, for example, or the width of the canal. That might be considered a more material change. And at that stage, you need to essentially apply again for planning permission. But I've put there, you can use section 73 applications. That's a modification to existing permission, and they sort of rely on the council relies on the existing permission to sort of justify it with the additional plans that you provide showing the new proposal. Again, important to agree changes with the planning authority in advance. Possibly submit another pre-application inquiry. Doesn't need to be, even though you've got planning permission, there's nothing stopping you doing that again, and that will allow them to consider it. in detail before you then apply for your apply for a new permission. So conclusions. So just sort of wrapping up everything before I show you some examples of them from the Schoolhouse Bridge project. Check whether your development requires planning permission or other types of planning consent at the start of the project. Do remember that it might benefit from permitted development rights. Obtain a certificate of lawful development if there's any doubt as to whether the project benefits from permitted development rights, and that's to protect you and the project essentially. So I'd highly recommend that. Seek pre-application advice from the local planning authority and the Canal and River Trust. But in brackets there, discussed that before, if it's managed by the waterway, if the waterway is managed by the trust or will eventually connect to the trust network, we can provide advice on that in order to help make sure it meets our standards, and we're happy to sort of connect to it. Engage with local members, councillors at pre-application stage, and obviously throughout the application. Appoint a planning consultant or someone with appropriate experience to help with the application, so they'll be able to prepare and submit the application on your behalf. Use specialist consultants for reports. Again, there, remember to compare any sort of quotes, fee proposals from them. Ensure plans are clear, contain as much information as possible to explain the proposal, and remember that context is important. One thing I'll just add there is a subtle difference between engineering drawings and planning drawings. Planning drawings are more concerned with the external appearance, the look and feel of something, how it relates to the context. Engineering drawings are very much focused on the asset or the structure that you're trying to improve, and will generally contain more information than's needed at planning stage. Nothing stopping you from submitting them, but it tends to, given that planning isn't necessarily involved with the engineering detail side of things, it may be worth having a set of planning drawings as well to submit for the application. Undertake public consultation. Try to accommodate suggestions and changes where possible. You don't necessarily have to, there may be reasons you're unable to, but it's quite important that you just explain why that can't be done. Build strong working relationship with local planning authority. Engage them at an early stage, keep them informed of progress. So if they've asked for additional information, make sure you timely explain when you're going to submit it. Keep up the dialogue with the case officer, and also try and coordinate responses to local planning authority. So the best way of doing that is via your planning consultant or someone you've nominated to do that job. There's nothing worse than having multiple people trying to tell you the same but slightly different things. As a sort of council case officer, it's quite helpful to have one point of contact who can then essentially project manage the planning side of things for you, and make sure that everything's running on track. There you go there. So I'm just going to quickly show some examples from Schoolhouse Bridge, and then we'll have a final Q&A at the end, which will hopefully address some questions. Now, Katie, are you able to see the PDFs?
Yes, we can see the PDF.
Perfect. Okay. So these are just some of the plans that were done for Schoolhouse Bridge. They were done by our in-house urban designers, but equally an architect, engineer, anybody with CAD skills would be able to prepare plans similar to this. Here's an example of a location plan, shows the sort of outline of the site. So this is where we were proposing to construct a new bridge over the Montgomery Canal to allow obviously boats to pass underneath it. This had all been filled in, and so there was just a road on top, so we needed to basically remove that, build a new bridge, and then boats go underneath. a few more details. There's different scale plans, so you'd usually have a layout plan, site location plans, that's sort of context next to the nearest village, for example. Site location plan zoomed in a bit more detail. This is the existing site plans, that's what's there at the moment. We've got existing elevations, so you can sort of see the bridges going round here. It's quite hard to see on those plans, but that shows the current context of the site. We've then got a proposed site plan. So this sort of shows the indicative route of the canal, location of the new bridge, and all the detail sort of surrounding that. That's like sort of the bird's eye view of the project. Land ownership plan. This particular project had quite complex land ownership. Not all projects will. Some will just be owned entirely by the trust or by another trust or organisation, and that will make things a lot simpler. This is a good way of just showing who owns what, and obviously you can derive the information required for the certificates that you've got to submit as part of the planning application from that plan. And all the information from that was taken from land registry and contacts that the restoration partnership were involved with. This is the sort of detailed elevations and sections. So as you can see, they are detailed. They sort of show indicative materials. You can very clearly see what's been proposed via these plans, and these are all developed from just sketches of the scheme, put into CAD, and with that we were able to work with sort of changing scales, changing materials. Any tweaks that are required could all be done relatively easily. And we're also, the crucial things probably is we've been able to actually measure things, for example, boats, height of the bridge, making sure people could walk through easily. All quite important things, but it's not until you've actually laid out and have the ability to check that it becomes obvious where there's issues with that. Scheduling materials. I'd recommend this. It's a good way of explaining to the council what materials you're planning to use. For example, you've got typical restoration things. You've got gabions, red brick, coping, fencing, different types of materials, explanation of what they are. The good thing about doing this is that if materials do change, you can just essentially swap this plan. So agree with the council that you're going to make changes, and they may allow you to just swap out the plan with the new materials. It's a good way of just explaining the overall look. And all these images are just from examples where they've used those materials. This is an example of a report. So this is one of the ecological appraisal reports. This was prepared for Schoolhouse Bridge. I'm not going to bore you by going through the full report. It made a number of recommendations, and those were then incorporated into the planning application and our mitigation and everything that we did in order to make it acceptable in ecological terms. And part of that was landscaping. So we had to basically make sure that what we were removing was replaced with suitable sort of replacement planting. Another type of survey, this was a bat survey. So we had to remove a tree for this project, and that had potential for bats in. So we had to do a survey to check there weren't any bats, to make sure that we weren't. They're a protected species, so we needed to make sure we weren't sort of harming their habitat. Agricultural report again for trees, and another landscape plan there. So the final thing here is just the decision notice. So this is from Shropshire Council. All councils will have a similar looking decision. It explains the type of development, who's applied, application number, etc. And then you'll have a series of conditions relating to the application. So as I said, standard timeframes, 3 years for a permission. It will set out which drawings have been approved, and those are listed at the end of this document. And there's various different conditions here that will require approval before the development commences. So, for example, condition 4 here requires details of the bricks to be used to be submitted, and that's so that the council can check basically that they're happy with what's been proposed. And there's a number of other conditions which need to be submitted before the development can commence. And then there's another range of conditions that are valid, they've said, for the lifetime of development. So you just need to make sure, for example, here they needed a nesting box. So we just need to install that and just make sure that it's retained going forward on that. So that's about it in terms of what decision notice looks like and the sort of types of plans that we would we'd need to submit as part of the planning application. And now I'm happy to sort of take some more questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Lewis, for such an informative insight into the world of planning consents. We have had a fair few questions put into the Q&A box, so I'm aware that we're running slightly over time today, but we should have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer a few of these. Any questions that we don't get round to answering, we'll send straight to you, Lewis, and then you'll be able to follow up them in due course. So yeah, I'll start with this one first. If the Canal and River Trust own the freehold of an unrestored section of the canal, and we are just the Restoration Society with no formal legal interest in the land, should Canal and River Trust front any objection to a neighbouring planning application, but with input from the society? Not sure how the logistics of the liaison between CRT planners and the Restoration Society work. Will the local planning authority ignore us if we object? For your information, it relates to electrical cabling from a proposed solar park under the unrestored canal. Quite a long question, that.
Very detailed question. I'd say that needs looking into more. By all means, approach us if we're the freeholder. Approach potentially the estates team for that particular type of project. If you can provide more details, I'll pass on their details to you.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. So what's the difference between a scoping app and a pre-app?
They are they're different things. So pre-application relates to planning, purely planning. So your proposal, how you're going to, and you're seeking advice from the council on the acceptability of the proposal in planning terms. Scoping is relating to an environmental impacts assessment side of planning. So that's determining the scope of what that environmental assessment should cover. I haven't covered that in great depth here. As I said, that only applies to major applications that fall within the threshold for requiring environmental impact assessment to be undertaken. So for the most part, you will just need a pre-application advice for the first half of that. Okay,
thank you. There's another one regarding pre-applications. If the pre-app advice is not supporting the project, are you okay to continue with an application, explaining in the application why you think it should be allowed and addressing the issues in dispute?
Yes, simple answer. Although in that case, I'd look to reapply for pre-application advice if they've really. It really depends what the issues are and if you believe they can be resolved. If it's because you haven't submitted a particular document, for example, and it's quite easily addressed, you may wish to just apply for planning permission and just go ahead and address the points that you said. If they are, major objections to it, to be honest, I'd rethink the proposal. Just make sure you're happy to proceed with it. I'd seek more pre-application advice on any particular aspects they've picked up on, and to try and reach agreement before submitting the application. It will only help further down the line with that, if we're able to do it. If you do submit an application, they will need to consider it in accordance with the planning policy, any comments, material considerations received. If it complies with those, they'll have to grant permission. If it doesn't, they are able to refuse it. You are able to appeal a refusal. I really wouldn't allow it to come to that stage. I'd try to agree all the issues up front before submitting for planning.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. We're looking to restore a Lengthman's hut on a disused canal and river trust land, where one wall would need to be taken down and rebuilt using original materials, but will need new tiles, timbers for the roof. Will planning be needed?
Did it say it belongs to Canal and River Trust?
Yes.
That is an example of a project, providing it's not listed, which may fall under Part 8 Class B. So they're the rights that the trust uses to be able to do works similar to that. It needs to be used. It needs to be on operational land and used in connection with the canal. I suppose it depends what the end use of that building is going to be, to a certain extent. But if it's our building, we can advise on that. So again, if you want to get in touch, we can have a look at that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Canal and River Trust for offering free pre-application advice, but I understand EA charges a fee. What about EH and NH?
They all charge fees. It's a commercial commercial arm. We obviously offer free advice. I mean, it's obviously in our interest to make sure that schemes are can connect to our network and things and are acceptable to us. In the case of English Heritage and the other ones, as I said before, not all schemes will need pre-application advice from them, and it depends on the nature of the scheme. If there's particular issues, if you're knocking down a grade grade 1 listed building, which has got bats in, for example, clearly you're going to need advice from those two organisations. They do charge fees; they are quite expensive, but unresolved, those issues would result in a refusal of a planning application. So it is important that if you do need advice from them, that you get that early.
Thank you. There used to be reduced planning application fees for charities. Is this still the case?
Not as far as I'm aware. Pre-application fees, they do tend to be reduced. If you are a parish council, I believe you also get reduced fees, and sports societies. But yes, you'll need to check the fees, but I don't believe there are for these sort of projects.
Okay. What is discharging a planning condition?
So that was the part I was explaining at the end of the presentation. So where we had the decision notice up, and we had the conditions that needed to be discharged before the application, that essentially means that you need to provide the information required by that condition to the council before you can start work on site. So the example I gave was for materials. So they asked for details of the brick that was going to be used. So you'd basically apply to the council. You'd say, I want to use this brick, and they, you fill in the form, send them the brick or a photograph of the brick, and they'll agree that, and then they'll reply with essentially a letter saying, yes, we're happy with the brick. This condition has been discharged, and then you can go ahead and proceed with that.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. We've got 2 more questions, so I think if we fly through these and then we can wrap it up. How necessary or sensible is it to renew an outline planning permission with ES for the restoration of a route rather than, for funding reasons, continue to submit full applications on small sections? The route is largely infilled, but with some new sections. Some of the LPAs have local plan protection policies, but there are potential threats by regional transport operators.
Could I ask you to repeat the first bit of that? It's an outline permission with an environmental statement, and they want to renew it.
Yes.
Correct.
The restoration of a route rather than for funding reasons. Might need some clarification on that one.
It may do. If a permission has been implemented, then the time limit falls away. So it depends whether you submitted any reserve matters applications for that. So they're the parts that the for everyone else, they're sort of essentially big conditions. So you have an outline permission, which is sort of the general principle of things, and then that will have multiple parts of it. So it would have a look at design, access, layout, transport. I can't remember all the all the categories, but each of those can then be submitted to the council as separate smaller applications for consideration of just those issues. So if the outline application and all of those had been approved by the council and you'd started work on site, that permission would then be live and you wouldn't need to reapply. If the outline permission has expired and you haven't done that, you would need to reapply if you wanted to do all the works under one permission. I think you then said that you could do individual permissions. That's always open to you as an option, but I suppose you would lose the overall context for the scheme. I suppose it's probably more helpful in that case to show that you are linking every single bit. It's probably simpler actually to apply for that basis.
Last question. What assistance can Canal and River Trust give when the canal route is closed and not on a Canal and River Trust waterway?
Some, but not as much, is probably what I'd say. So obviously, forums like this are probably helpful to some extent in terms of the advice we provide. Restoration team, so Katie, you're obviously in that team, aren't you? And then Peter Walker can probably provide some sort of general advice, but we obviously are concerned mostly with our land and connections to it.
Great, thank you, Lewis. So thank you all for joining us today and sharing your thoughts, your questions and experiences. Thank you to Lewis for taking the time to deliver this webinar. And thank you to our colleagues, Jen and Alex, who are working in the background behind the scenes to make sure that everything has been running smoothly. Remember that we are still delivering our webinar programme as part of the virtual annual Waterways Restoration Conference. Our next webinar is tomorrow, and that's with Alison Smedley from the IWA delivering a talk on engaging local councils and getting your MP on board with your restoration. Thanks again, and we hope to see many of you on Thursday. Thanks, Lewis.